Welcome everyone to a journey into the darkest hidden corners of World War II, where the line between hero and sinner has become only a pale red haze. Most history books speak of grand strategies and metal-covered generals, but today we will look at the men who were erased before they even began. This is the untold story of Lieutenant Frank Taksky and the platoon of the castaways, the men the darkness came to know as the 40 Thieves. The air inside the prison of Camp Tarawa in Hawaii carried no scent of sea salt or tropical flowers. It reeked of old sweat, rusty iron, and the suffocating, all-consuming smell of men forgotten by both God and the United States Marine Corps. In June 1944, as the world prepared for a massive invasion of Saipan, Lieutenant Frank Taksky walked past the iron bars with a clipboard that carried a weight more terrifying than a death sentence. He was not searching for the most immaculate uniforms or the soldiers who saluted with the sharpest precision. He was searching for the monsters the military had tried to cage. He was searching for men like Elias, a 20-year-old from the coal mines of Pennsylvania, sitting in the corner of a windowless cell, his hands scarred from a lifetime of fighting, things that could not be beaten. Elias had been discarded after a brutal brawl that sent a superior officer to the hospital and left Elias in chains. In the eyes of the Corps, he was a burden, a violent mistake. But when Taksky stood before the cell, his back cutting across the corridor's dim yellow light, he did not see a criminal. He saw a survivor. Taksky's recruiting criteria were deceptively simple and terrifyingly practical. He did not want the man who lost the fight. He wanted the man who walked out of the rubble. He sought hoodlums, street fighters, and professional killers, men who had traded military service to avoid a firing squad or a lifetime behind bars. These were men who understood that in the darkness of the jungle, a manual on military decorum was cheaper than the dirt beneath their fingernails. Taksky spoke in a low, rasping voice, carrying no promises of medals or glorious parades. He told Elias the mission ahead was a suicide pact signed in invisible ink. Marine planners had calculated the numbers, estimating a casualty rate of 73% for scout snipers in the Pacific. For a unit of men who could be thrown away, that rate would certainly be far worse. Taksky offered a choice that was not truly a choice: stay in this cage and rot in obscurity, or go with him to Saipan and become a ghost. He needed men who could think for themselves, men who knew how to fight dirty, and men who could kill in absolute silence. He needed 40 thieves to do the work the moral men in Washington did not have the courage to do. Elias stood, his body aching after weeks of confinement, and stared straight into the eyes of the man handing him a ticket to an early grave. A strange and harsh understanding passed between them. This was not about patriotism or the flag. This was about the primal violent instinct to keep breathing when everything else is screaming for you to stop. When Elias stepped out of that cell, leaving his name and his past behind, he realized he was not joining a platoon. He was joining a pack of wolves. They were the unwanted, the broken, and the predators gathered under a commander who valued their sins more than their virtues. The recruitment ended, and the long, dark journey toward the shores of Saipan began, where 40 soldiers would soon learn that the only thing more dangerous than the enemy was the darkness they carried within their own souls. The sun over Camp Tarawa in Hawaii was a tireless observer, but for the 40 Thieves, the real work began only where light could not reach. In 6 months, the island became a laboratory of lethal invention. Lieutenant Taksky did not merely want soldiers. He wanted ghosts who could breathe under pressure and predators who could dismantle a human life without leaving even a whisper behind. This was not the United States Marine Corps of polished brass buttons and perfectly synchronized marching steps. This was a school for the damned, where the curriculum was written in the language of assassination, theft, and the terrifying art of disappearing. Elias spent his days learning that a knife was not merely a tool, but an extension of a cold will. Beneath the dense canopy of Hawaii's ancient jungle, they practiced geometry on a man's throat, how to approach a sentry from the blind spot, how to smother a scream with a calloused palm. They moved through the low layers of foliage like smoke taught to step on the edge of the boot, to avoid snapping dry branches and to read the shifting of leaves as if it were a map to the enemy's soul. Taksky watched them with the stillness of a hunting beast, often stepping out of the shadows without warning to press the cold barrel of a pistol to a soldier's temple, a silent reminder that in their world a single mistake was the permanent end. The training went far beyond the physical. They were forced to study the enemy with a meticulousness that bordered on grotesque. They memorized the shapes of Japanese fortifications, the patrol patterns of the Imperial Army, and even the nuances of a language they had been assigned to silence. But perhaps the most important skill Taksky cultivated was the art of theft. He did not care about military bureaucracy. He cared about results. He encouraged his men to raid army supply depots for better rations and navy warehouses for advanced equipment. Elias discovered a grotesque talent for disabling locks and manipulating the egos of logistics officers. They were called the 40 Thieves, not only for their past, but for their present ability to strip from the world whatever they needed to survive. Takski's methods were designed to erode a soldier's traditional moral compass. He promoted a culture of independent brutality. He would throw Elias into fights with men twice his size in hand-to-hand pits, refusing to stop the match until one man could no longer stand. There were no referees, only the harsh recognition that victory at any cost was the only measure of success. Elias felt his old self, the boy who had fought out of desperation in the coal mines, being replaced by something numb and hollow. When 6 months of training ended, 40 soldiers had become a razor blade, honed by a commander who knew the normal rules of war were only suggestions for men who were not expected to return. When they boarded the transport ships bound for the Mariana Islands, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, focused silence. They did not sing the Marine Corps hymn. They checked their Springfield rifles, adjusted their 8 power scopes, and sharpened their Ka-bar knives until the steel hissed. They knew the intelligence reports 30,000 Japanese troops waiting on a 14-mile strip of rock called Saipan. They knew the Corps expected them to die at a rate that defied all logic. But when Elias looked at the scarred faces of the men beside him, he saw no fear, only a dark, seething readiness. They were thieves of life, prepared to enter a territory where the only thing more hostile than the terrain was the mission they had been created to carry out. At 8:44 a.m. on June 15, 1944, the world became a furnace of steel and seawater. Elias sat in the belly of the Higgins boat, his spine vibrating with the mechanical roar of the engine and the dull explosions of Japanese coastal artillery. The wooden ramp in front of them was the only thing separating the 40 Thieves from a shoreline already red with the first waves of United States Marines. When the final ramp dropped, it was not an entrance into glory, but a plunge into a watery grave of chaos. The Pacific was no longer blue. It was a frothing soup of white foam, black sand, and smoke from burning oil. Elias stepped into water, chest deep, the weight of his gear threatening to drag him under as machine gun fire seized the thin lines between life and death across the surface of the waves. Beside him, men he had trained with vanished into the surf without a sound swallowed by coral or shrapnel. Lieutenant Takski was a silhouette of iron determination ahead, waving them forward through the salt water. There was no time for horror to seep in, no space for pain. The 40 Thieves moved with desperate focus, crawling over the seawall and into the shattered debris of the landing zone. They did not dig trenches like the others. They did not wait for orders from headquarters. They had been made to disappear, and as the invasion roared behind them, 40 soldiers slipped into the thick green of Saipan's ancient jungle. The island's interior was an assault on the senses of humidity and silence. Within minutes, the sounds of the beach became a distant echo, replaced by the unnatural stillness of a forest holding 30,000 enemies in its breath. Elias felt a shift in his blood from a war soldier to a predator. They moved in a staggered line, 50 yards apart, communicating through hand signals and eye contact. The ground was a minefield of volcanic rock and tangled roots, reaching to seize their boots. Every shadow was a potential sniper, every rustle of wind a Japanese patrol that could appear. The intelligence reports had promised 30,000 troops, and Elias felt their weight from every direction. By mid-morning, the 40 Thieves had pushed 300 yards inland, far beyond the main defensive lines of the Marine Corps. They were alone inside the belly of the beast. Elias looked back and saw only the wall of vegetation they had crossed. The mission was clear. Map what could not be mapped, find the hidden arteries of Japanese defense, and report coordinates before the enemy could discover their ghosts. But reality was far more naked than the briefings. The jungle was a labyrinth of camouflaged caves and underground tunnels, concrete pillboxes invisible until you stood face to face with the muzzle of a Type 92 machine gun. Elias gripped his Springfield, realizing survival training in Hawaii had been only a shadow of the truth. The jungle did not merely hide the enemy, it was the enemy. As the first 9 hours of the invasion passed, the sun began to sink, casting long black skeletal shadows across the forest floor. Takski gathered them into a tight circle, silent beneath a banyan canopy. They had survived the landing, but the real trial had only begun. Night on Saipan was not a time for rest. It was the domain of infiltrators. The Japanese were masters of night attacks, and the 40 Thieves were the only thing standing between the vulnerable beachhead and a counterattack. Elias watched the light fade, feeling that in the coming weeks, sleep would become only a memory, and darkness their only ally. They were 40 men against an empire lost in a green hell, and the only way out was to move through the heart of the nightmare they had been sent to map. The dampness of Saipan's ancient jungle felt like a wet burial shroud clinging to Elias's skin as he lay motionless in a cluster of ferns. It was 10:15 a.m. on the second day, the air thick with the copper scent of blood and the smell of fermenting vegetation. A few hundred yards off their flank, a regular Marine squad was pinned down in a ravine. Elias could hear panicked screams, desperate calls for a corpsman, and the steady chattering of a Japanese Type 92 machine gun. He looked to Lieutenant Taksky, waiting for the signal to intervene. But Taksky remained still, as a stone statue, his eyes fixed on something deeper in the valley. He raised a finger to his lips, absolute silence. Taksky's binoculars were aimed at a banyan cluster half a mile away, the leaves rippling in an unnatural pattern. When Elias adjusted his scope, the horror became clear. It was not only a machine gun nest. Hidden beneath camouflage netting was the staging area of a Japanese tank battalion. 37 Type 97 tanks. Engines, silent crews waiting like venomous spiders in their burrow. If the 40 thieves opened fire to save the squad, they would reveal their position to a force that could crush the beachhead. This was the dark arithmetic of the scout sniper. Saving 10 men meant sacrificing intelligence that could save thousands. Elias felt an icy pain in his chest as the screams from the ravine faded. They were not only thieves of life, they were thieves of mercy. Taksky's decision took less than 30 seconds. He signaled Elias and the bazooka teams to move into a semicircle, not to attack, but to prepare an ambush if the tanks advanced toward the beach. Taksky did not want good men. He wanted men who could endure the smell of death while calculating wind drift for a shot. They watched Japanese soldiers finish off the survivors in the ravine with bayonets. Elias clenched his rifle, aching to scream, but the weight of the mission kept him silent. They were ghosts, and ghosts do not intervene in the world of the living. At 4:25 p.m., the situation shifted from observation to a desperate gamble. Japanese tank engines began to roar, shaking the ground. They were not merely repositioning, they were preparing to attack at dusk. Taksky checked his watch and looked at his men. They had 6 bazookas and 36 rockets. There were 37 tanks. Those numbers were a cruel joke, an invitation to suicide. Taksky signaled a tactical withdrawal, but Elias saw one tank break away from the main force. It moved toward a hidden ravine that led straight to the headquarters of the 6th Marine Regiment. If that tank broke through, the entire defensive coordination would collapse. This was the devil's choice: keep the position secret and let headquarters be destroyed, or act and bring the battalion's wrath down on their own heads. Taksky chose to attack. He grabbed Elias's shoulder and pointed to a rocky outcrop 30 yards from the tank. They ran with lungs burning, ignoring thorns tearing at their skin. When the tank emerged from the brush, Elias felt the world slow down. He provided cover as the bazooka gunner Hayes aimed. The rocket fired, striking exactly where the turret met the hull. The blast was a blinding orange fireball, a violent rupture in the jungle's silence. Headquarters was safe, but the 40 thieves were no longer invisible. The hunt had reversed, and every Japanese soldier in the valley was now searching for ghosts in the brush. The morning of the 3rd day brought a chilling realization: the jungle was no longer a refuge. It was becoming a tightening noose. To provide the high command with the location of the Japanese main staging area, the 40 thieves had to enter the ruins of Garapan, the pre-war capital, now a graveyard bristling with charred concrete blocks and the Empire's stubborn resolve. Lieutenant Taksky looked at his men, their faces hollow, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and the constant adrenaline of the hunted. They had to move through the heart of the enemy's urban fortress, a place where even a single American uniform would be a beacon drawing thousands of gun barrels. At the eastern edge of that shattered town, Elias noticed something strange. 5 Japanese military bicycles leaned against what remained of a pharmacy. A dark, reckless spark flared in Taksky's eyes. He ordered them to shed their gear, remove their heavy PAX helmets and tactical harnesses, keeping only pistols and knives hidden under their jackets. The plan was a plunge into madness. They would pedal straight through the center of Garapan, disguised as Japanese couriers moving through the dusty haze and chaos of bombardment. Elias felt the cold metal of the handlebars under his palms, a sensation so ordinary it felt unreal among the ruins. As they pedaled onto the main Axis road, the world became a blur of gray ash and rising heat. Japanese soldiers were everywhere, hundreds of them hauling supplies, dragging wounded men, and reinforcing wine cellar bunkers. The stench was an assault of rot and gunpowder. Elias's heart hammered in his chest like a caged bird, but he kept his head down, his movements slow, mimicking the weary posture of an imperial soldier. They passed within arm's reach of an officer shouting orders to a work party. The officer stared directly at Elias, his eyes narrowing through the gunsmoke. Elias did not flinch. He gave a slight nod, a shared gesture of exhaustion. The officer turned away, distracted by a new explosion near the harbor. For 43 minutes, the ghosts rode through the beast's belly. They did not merely survive. They counted. They mapped ammunition dumps, identified antenna masts of hidden command posts, and recorded troop concentrations in the northern sector. Each turn of the pedals felt like a countdown to execution. They saw things that would never leave them. Civilians huddled in corners with grenades in their hands and the hollow eyes of those who knew they were already dead. This was the true value of the 40 Thieves, the ability to hide in plain sight, to steal secrets while breathing the same poisoned air as the enemy. When they reached the northern outskirts and abandoned the bicycles in a stagnant drainage ditch, the tension cracked open, replaced by a spreading icy horror. They had gained the information, but lost a piece of their humanity in that town. They had played the enemy so well, the line between infiltration and complicity felt thin. They disappeared back into the forest edge, moving toward the high ridges, carrying coordinates that would soon call down a rain of fire from warships offshore. Elias looked back at the smoke rising over Garapan and realized that, while they stole the enemy's plans, the island was also slowly stealing their souls, one desperate gamble at a time. The intelligence gathered at Garapan bought the Marine Corps an opportunity, but it also painted a target on the backs of the 40 Thieves. By the afternoon of the 5th day, the Japanese realized a ghost unit was operating deep behind their lines, sabotaging communications and calling down hell from the sea. As Elias and the remaining men of the platoon tried to withdraw toward American lines, Saipan's geography became a death trap. They were driven into a deep, narrow box canyon with only one entrance and exit. The sound of pursuit was a chaotic symphony of signal whistles and the rhythmic pounding of boots through the brush. At least 40 Japanese soldiers were closing in, their fury, felt in the blind, firing into the canopy. Elias lay at the canyon floor, his lungs burning and his canteen empty. Beside him, 2 soldiers were in despair, one trembling with malaria, one clutching a wound in his abdomen. Tatsuki looked up at the sheer walls, then looked at his men. Standard military procedure was to dig in and fight to the last man to buy time. But these were not standard soldiers, and Tatsuki was not a standard officer. He made the devil's decision they would not die for a scrap of ground. In the darkness of the rear wall, Elias noticed a cluster of ferns trembling from a cool draft. He crawled toward it, tore away the vegetation, and revealed a narrow crack in the limestone, an artery hidden in rock wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Tatsuki ordered the wounded moved first. The process was excruciating. They had to remove packs, drag them, their ragged breathing echoing in the suffocating dark of stone. Outside, the Japanese reached the canyon mouth, their victory shouts turning to confusion when they found only abandoned equipment and a blood trail vanishing into the cliff. The passage was a dark, suffocating throat slanting upward at a punishing angle. Elias moved by feel his fingers bleeding from scraping sharp rock. Every few minutes he had to stop to help lift the Marine burning with fever. Behind them, they heard the Japanese entering, the cracked flashlight beams dancing along the rock walls. It was a race through the earth. Tatsuki stayed at the rear, a ghost among ghosts, his pistol ready. The moral weight of the retreat crushed Elias, the awareness that they were leaving their mark on the island. Not with a flag, but with the desperate claw marks of men refusing to accept a heroic ending. When they emerged onto the high ridge, the sun was only an ember on the horizon. They were 400 yards from where they had entered, looking down at Japanese soldiers still searching the canyon floor. They had escaped, but the price was carved into their faces. 2 more men had gone missing in the chaos of the retreat, their bodies left behind in shallow, unmarked graves. Elias looked at Tatsuki, his eyes like deep pits of exhaustion. They were safe for now, but survival felt like stolen goods. They had slipped past death once again, but every time they slid through the fingers of the Reaper, they left behind a piece of their humanity in the darkness of the caves. By July 9th, 1944, the screaming of artillery shells had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt like a tangible weight. Saipan was declared secure, but for the survivors of the 40 Thieves, there was no celebration. They stepped out of the jungle for the last time, a ragged line of 34 men who looked more like corpses than the living. Their uniforms were rotted by humidity. Their skin yellowed from quinine and jaundice, and their eyes carried the vacant stare of men who had seen too much horror. A kind of horror sunlight could never burn away. They passed replacement troops with young faces and regular units busy hanging flags and posing for cameras. No one cheered for them. To the rest of the United States Marine Corps, they were still troublemakers, misfits who had vanished into green hell and returned like hollowed out bodies. The statistics of their war were written in blood: 9 killed, 9 wounded, and an intelligence legacy that saved an estimated 2,000 men. But the real cost was not in the numbers. Elias stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the smoking shadow of Saipan shrink into the Pacific haze. He felt a profound dislocation. They had stolen the enemy's secrets, sabotaged its tanks, and lived like ghosts among the dying. And yet they felt like strangers to the country they had served. Takski stood at the rail beside him, his face an iron mask. There were no medals for what they had done in the dark, no commendations for the mercy they had been forced to suppress, or the comrades they had been forced to leave behind. They were invisible architects of a victory they were not allowed to own. The tragedy of the 40 thieves did not end when the ceasefire sounded. When they returned to the world of white fences and civilian work, the darkness still clung to them. The devil's decisions they had made on the island became nightmares that woke them in the middle of the night. In an era when the world did not yet understand the scars of post-traumatic stress disorder, these men were left to drown memory in alcohol or bury it in silence inside their own homes. Frank Takski later became a mayor, a respected citizen who never spoke a word about the 40 men he had led. Not until he died in 2011 did his son find a hidden chest revealing a history buried for 66 years. They were a secret kept even from their own families, a brotherhood of ghosts whose service was the final theft, a sacrifice stolen from the pages of history. As we close this chapter on the 40 thieves, let their story remind us that the price of freedom is often paid by those the world deems unworthy. They were criminals who became saviors and ghosts who held the line when the light went out. If you find value in this untold historical story and want to ensure these names are never forgotten, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Your support helps us bring these buried stories back into the light. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether it's the United States, the United Kingdom, or anywhere else in the world, and tell us if you have a relative who served in the Pacific Theater. We honor their memory by sharing the truth about them. Thank you for watching, and never forget the soldiers who walked through hell so we could walk under the sun.